Into the 7 o'clock hour, we continue on with the conversations here in Morning at NTV. I am Priscilla Regina Deloga. Our kickstarter this Thursday's morning is going to be reflecting on the Democratic Republic of Congo's elections, the impact on the region, as well as the diplomatic hiccups escalating between the DRC and the East African community. The backbone of it being that DRC's December 2023 elections raised concerns about the internal stability amidst the political scrutiny and the nation's accelerated integration into the East African community taking center stage. Meanwhile, less attention is being given to the DRC's move into achieving greater economic integration with the East African community by joining the regional grouping during the incumbent's term. To unwrap this conversation, I am joined by Ambassador Henry Mayega, who is the Uganda Consul General in Dubai, to help us unpack our neighbors just observations of the elections. They had the elections yesterday on the 20th, electing the head of state and members of parliament as well as councillors, and so the counting is on, and in a few days we'll be having the announcement of the winner. But while we are here today, we want to understand how things are going, and so we'll start by saying good morning, Ambassador, and you're most welcome once again.
Good morning to you. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
It's a pleasure to have you in your capacity to give us your views on this conversation. Now, we do have the Democratic Republic of Congo having gone into elections yesterday, but it's been with rather, I would say, in my opinion, a peaceful campaign trail, having 22 candidates just on the presidency ballot paper. Interesting.
Absolutely it is, but I think in the first place we, in my view, have to thank the East African region, especially President Yoweri Museveni, because he has stayed longest when you look at the rest of the heads of state in the region, and he has been championing this East African community build-up, and the results are in the open, with DRC joining the EAC, Somalia joining Southern Sudan, and quite a couple of others. And the others, I understand, probably could be on the way, including Ethiopia. Right now, as we talk, the regional grouping has a population of 329 million people, and that, in my view, it's a very big opportunity for us to trade with each other and make our economies stronger, so to speak. Because when you look at the EU, what's happening? I mean, the population is much smaller than what we have in the East African region, because it's in the region of something like 280 or something thereabout. So when we have this grouping in East Africa, I think that is a plus for us, and the DRC definitely needs this region as much as we also need it. Geographically, we are together. In terms of politics, given the fact that, of course, DRC was a Belgian colony in the past, they speak French, we speak English, but that doesn't matter. So Swahili seems to be, permeating the entire region. And there is so much, in other words, that brings us together. Having said that, there is also another very important opportunity, because you see, if we don't put these things in the perspective that is correct, we may not understand where the DRC is and where the vis-a-vis the East African community region. Because the Belgians, when they were in charge of that country, they made sure that the DRC, the way we know it, it used to be the Congo, of course, as you know. The DRC came much later as a name for that country. They made sure that actually that country remains an area for exploitative purposes, not to create effective government. And therefore that lack of effective government has created lots of problems, not only for the current DRC, but also the region. Because as we speak, you know, I don't know how many rebel groups, for instance, do exist in the eastern part of that country. And so there has not been effective government, most especially in the eastern part of the country, the DRC. And so when the East African region comes in to put these things, to put us together and make sure that the security situation in that country makes sense not only to the inhabitants of that country, but also for the region, I think that is also a very good idea. And of course, you have mentioned that the elections have been peaceful in spite of the fact that there are so many rebel groups. Yes, because I think the aspiration of everybody in that country is that there should be peace and there should be elections that are respected by everybody. But because you and I know that in many cases on the African continent it becomes extremely difficult for somebody to say that these elections have been free and fair. Of course, there will be others who will say that they are free and fair depending on who wins. In Africa, we are yet to appreciate the fact that when you go for a contest, there should be a winner and a loser. So these elections, vis-a-vis that lack of effective government in that country and the political turmoil that the DRC has been going through, are two. But at the same time, in my view, they've been really, should I say, things that have been taking place together. The politics in the country, the way it has been unfolding, and also the insecurities that have been existing in that country as a result of the ineffective government, and most especially in the eastern part of the country. And for us as neighbors, of course, we have had to pay the price. And I'm happy that our country and the leadership under President Yoweri Museveni has been really spot on to work out an arrangement to ensure that we go in to try and put things in a peaceful environment. I mean, promote peace in that country. Of course, the rest is history. Yeah. But we are there, as you and I know. We are there on bilateral relations, and I don't think that really has been a bad idea. Okay.
Yeah. All right. We do have observers that are always sent in to have a neutral observation of the elections. You do have the European Union will send in a team, the African Union will send in a team, even the East African region will send in a team. However, for Congo's time round, they have not been able to have some of these observation teams on ground. The EAC team has not been on ground. I think the only team that has been on ground is the African Union observation team. And so what does that speak into the way things were conducted and the conclusion of the election period in Kinshasa?
Absolutely, because again we go back to history. What has been the impact of election observers, especially those that come from without the continent? In my view, they don't make an impact, because in any case Africa must be led to grow in terms of the way they conduct their politics. I am not really convinced that somebody should come all the way from Europe to try and see what we do, the way we do things, and so on and so forth in terms of elections. In 1980, when we had elections here in this country, the EU was here, and quite a number of other observers. The Commonwealth was here, and so many others, and so on and so forth. But I think, in my view, we need to grow out of that situation where we think that people should always come from the West to watch our elections. And I'm happy that the African Union instead is presently on the ground and monitoring those elections. They will definitely give a report, which will be either an indictment of the elections, the way, the campaigns, how they were conducted, and the result that came as a result of those campaigns, and so on and so forth. So we really should have, like President Yoweri Museveni has always been arguing, homegrown solutions to African problems, rather than importing people from the yonder to come and get involved in our politics. Because in any case, we don't send teams to European country elections. We don't send teams as Africa, and so on, unless really people go there on their own volition.
It has to be a two-way arrangement.
Absolutely. So, but we must outgrow, in my view, the dictum that every other time an African country has got elections, that we should get these people from Europe, from the rest of all sorts of places that are outside the African continent.
From the diplomatic side of view, what's the importance of the outsider observation?
Well, the outside observation, yes, it's good. Of course, it gives credence, as some people have argued. I don't know whether it gives credence, because the observers are not the ones who are actually going to cast the vote. And behind the scenes, if somebody, for instance, was rig elections, it's a process. It takes probably something like 3 years. So you cannot convince me that somebody who comes 2 weeks to the elections, or even a month before elections, that actually will see whatever has been happening during that entire process of the entire political process. Because what we should understand, that elections are actually the epitomization of an entire political process. It's not something that comes in just one day, and of course the election results comes out, and then everybody gets convinced that yes, this. So in my view, yes, people can come and observe. They're free to come. But it's really not an obligation for any African country that it is a must, that people must come and watch these elections and then stamp them as probably having been credible and so on and so forth. We should learn to outgrow the situation where we think that others should come and watch over these elections and build capacity. As Africa, of course, I'm not saying that we are now 100% there in terms of really weeding out any irregularities in elections. You and I also know that even the Americans, even if they've had democracy for the last 250 years, they've had issues with the electoral processes. They are still having, by the way, electoral colleges. I hope Ugandans know. It's not that people directly elect a president or something like that. They go through whoever gets the biggest electoral colleges or the most numerous electoral colleges in the US emerges the winner, even if actually you counted the votes and somebody, for instance, got 80 million and another one. So you may find that somebody has got 80 million voters collectively casting the vote for that presidential candidate X, winning over somebody who has got 80 million, votes cast. Yeah, so it is still an electoral college, but ours is universal human suffrage. You cast the vote for the president, which doesn't happen in many of these countries, and therefore, in my view, I think ours is a better hybrid, even if we still have issues that we must put right. But the Americans have had democracy for the last 250 years. The European countries have had all these kinds of things for so many years, for actually centuries. They've had elections for centuries, but still there are issues. So you cannot tell me that we who have had democracy for the last, should I say something like 20 years, since the plebiscite that we had in 2005, that our thing should be taken as if it is really something that is...
It must come out 100%.
Yes, absolutely. So we must undergo, just like a lady gets pregnant and they go under the, especially when they're about to deliver, under the labor pains. So we are still undergoing those labor pains, political labor pains, for lack of a better description, what happens.
Okay. You have mentioned something in there, and you've talked about the issues that we still need to put right. What are you referring to? Okay.
I mean, yes, as I said before, we still have the universal human suffrage, that I cast a vote for the president and also for a member of parliament, especially where I vote from. And the other friends of ours, as I've said before, do the electoral colleges process. So what do we have to put right? What do we put right? First of all, there must be acceptance that when you go for elections, and you contest, you must either expect a win or a loss. That one we have failed to do. Every other time we have a round of elections, especially in our country here, people say that they've been rigged. I think there has to be, and sometimes it surprises me, because people are going to argue that elections have been rigged, but in the subsequent elections they go there to participate. So if elections have been rigged in all of these other past elections, why then do you go and continue to contest? I think, of course, credit them for that, because that persistence is good. Probably it's something that can help us to get out of that dilemma, that every other time somebody goes for elections, they will, after they have lost. Right. The winner, of course, will not say that they have been irregularities, but the loser will always say that they are irregularities, but they continue to actually participate in those elections. So we have to remove that in our minds, and we will continue, for instance, to make sure that the electoral process is as clean as it were, so that everybody can be brought on board to accept that elections, first of all, are predictable, like they are, because every 5 years, whoever wants to contest, if Ms. Naloga here wants to go and contest for elections in 2026, at least they're going to happen. Not like in the past, in the 1970s, when we didn't know, even part of the 1980s, we didn't know that elections would become predictable and regular. They were either takeovers or coups. So that one is past us. So and we must really credit the government for ensuring that that happens. Now, that confidence that every Ugandan should have, that when you go for elections, there must be a loser and a winner. And once you lose, you accept the result. And then probably wait for the next or subsequent round of elections. And then you go and participate, and probably you will win. Because people have won, actually, those who have lost in the past elections. And when they win in the subsequent elections, they don't complain that there actually have been irregularities. But also, as government, of course, there are responsibilities that we must undertake to make sure that everybody comes out satisfied, or at least a majority of the people, a majority of the voters come out satisfied that actually the electoral process has been as credible as possible.
Okay, all right. Still staying on that element of external observation, the DR Congress, that's the first time that they've actually refused to accredit observers such as the European Union. You do have them forcing the Brussels to cancel their mission in that regard. And other groups such as the Carter Center also had sent in observers. And so it begs the question, why is the Democratic Republic of Congo continuously choosing not to have external observers for their elections? One wonders, are they hiding something, or do they not want that interference of foreign influence coming to their state?
I think the issue of foreign influence is something probably Africa needs to take so seriously, because as I've said before, the Congo, especially the eastern part of the DRC, has been without effective government for a very long time. And for me, I want to blame the colonialists, although some people argue that they left that country a long time ago, and therefore we should now stop blaming them. But they are part of the problem.
Yeah.
And you know, the eastern Congo is a very interesting area because it has it's mineral rich. It has a lot of minerals and lots of other resources, like the forests which produce a lot of timber and so on and so forth. So by the EU, for instance, choosing not to be part of that process, and of course the DRC authorities coming out with a position that we definitely probably don't need you here as observers. The good thing is that the EU is on ground, and for me, I'm happy with that one, because those are what President Yoweri Museveni has been talking about, that we must have our own African solutions to African problems. The EU itself, if it's on ground, fine, that's okay in my view, rather than thinking that we can always import people from Europe to come and observe these elections. People coming from the Uganda to come and tell us that yes, here you're wrong or there, because the EU can perfectly, in my view, do that job without us having these people. So if the EU on their own volition have chosen actually not to be part of the monitoring process in the DRC during this electoral season, so be it, because others are on ground anyway. And I'm sure there is going to be a very, very credible report from the EU, and the fears probably by the DRC that the EU shouldn't be part of it, because they've been actually let's be blunt, the European countries, especially Belgium, have been part of the DRC problems because they left a country that did not have effective control over the entire country. Because the DRC has over 100 million population, people, in terms of population, and that is really something very big. And you don't want to hear how many people were killed during the colonial times. In the DRC, probably that population must have been, should have been much bigger than 104 million people of the DRC. So, if you're part of the problem in that country, you hear, for instance, of planes landing in the DRC at night and picking all sorts of resources from there and taking them away. So you're part of the problem. Yeah. So if the DRC complains about you, then that shouldn't surprise anybody. Because if you're part of the problem, then you shouldn't be posed as somebody who is actually providing a solution. And therefore, the AU, if it comes, because AU has not been part of that group which has been pilfering the resources of that country, so be it. Because these are people who are going to be respected, the airport is going to be respected, rather than other people who are coming from the Uganda and who have been part of the problem. So in my view, the AU is rightly in a position to ensure that they monitor those elections in the DRC, because these steps taken by the AU are part and parcel of what has been postulated by quite a number of leaders, including my own president, that Africa must have African solutions to African problems.
For Africans.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. So ineffective governance is something that we're going to be talking about later on. But let's talk about the impact of these elections, especially in line with the East African Community Growth and Development. What will be the impact for moving forward?
Well, those elections are extremely important for the region, for so many reasons. One of them is that the DRC, the EAC, has the biggest population. As I said, it's about 104 million people, beating Kenya, which has 55, Uganda, which has something like 45 million or 48 million. It's good that we are going for a census next year, and the process was launched by the president recently. with Rwanda having something like 8, Tanzania having something like 60, and so many other countries. Of course, the Sudan, which has, I think, something like 14. And if Ethiopia comes, like I hear, there are plans for Ethiopia to be part of the EAC, that will be a plus for this region, and it will become a very big trading bloc. And so, what is the impact of these elections? The impact is, of course, in my view, manifests in 2 ways. Because if the DRC is not stable and having elections, and if the elections become violent, which they have not, at least so far. Yeah. If they become violent, then that violence could spill over across the boundaries of the DRC, into Uganda, into Rwanda, into Burundi, and quite a number of other countries. And those spillovers probably would not even end with Uganda, but the entire inter-region would be affected, because this is the biggest country, this is mineral-rich country, and so on and so forth. So that's why all of us in this region are very interested about, we have a lot of interest in what comes out of those, and the conduct of the elections, and also the election result. It's extremely important for us to be on our, guard. We shouldn't lower the guard. We wish, of course, the Congolese the very best as they elect their leaders, and we want to be sure that the election results are going to be respected by everybody, so that there are no spillovers. It's extremely important, because this is the biggest country, it is a new member of the EAC, and we wish them the very best, because the DRC, as I said before at the beginning of this conversation, needs the EAC in terms of, I mean, we are neighbors. Yeah. And in terms of trading, the other day, you remember the URM7 administration has been constructing roads across the border. And there's a lot of trade. And somebody probably should find out how much the volume of trade is between Uganda and the DRC. It has also wider implications to the region in terms of trade, and so on and so forth. So all of us are very interested. The DRC needs the East African community. Uganda needs the East African community. The rest of the countries need the DRC. Those connections are extremely important for the region. Those connections are extremely important in many ways, because it is a plus to our trade prospects. It is a plus to our political stability as a region. It's a plus to the rest of the continent, the African continent. If the DRC is stable, and if the East African region is stable, then you will not see the AU coming to try and put out the embers that political embers that are going up in flames in not only in the DRC but also in the rest of the region. If the DRC remains stable, and if the elections came out with a verdict that everybody respects, so you can see that actually the results of those elections in the DRC are extremely important for the entire region, and also for the wider, because we're not talking about, for instance, the other countries that are not part of the EAC, that are neighboring the DRC. So you can see that the DRC bordering so many countries, and I'm not sure whether there is any country that borders so many countries like the DRC, because the East Africa, yes, borders the DRC. West Africa borders the DRC. You have the CAR to the north. You have Cameroon to the other side. You have Gabon. You have, I mean, this is a very important country. So it's a trigger point into the other side of Africa.
Well, we're definitely very, very interested in now the impact of East Africa. We do have one of the commitments of the regional bloc being peace and stability, and through that there's the East African Community Regional Forces. We're going to be having a conversation in that direction right after this break.
Morning at NTV.
In case you've just joined us, this is our Kickstarter Thursday's edition of Morning at NTV, and we are focusing on the most recent elections within the region, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo, who went to the electoral polls yesterday to make decision who's going to be their next president and members of the Legislative House. And then the impact of that on the region, as well as the diplomatic hiccups escalating between that country and the East African Regional Bloc. So far, we've touched base on the issues that have to be put right when it comes to elections generally. By and far, we do have the Ambassador Henry Mayega, who is giving us a perspective of this particular conversation. conversation. And we have also talked about the ineffective governance that seems to be looming because of the hands of the colonial masters still invisibly being on this particular country, hindering its peaceful growth and stability. And of course, the numerous militia groups that continue to destabilize it, especially on the eastern side of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which then comes into the conversation of peace and stability. We do have one of the commitments of the East African Regional Bloc, Ambassador, being focused on regional peace, and therefore we do have the regional forces that have been in the DRC, and there's also been standby teams. So that has been happening for quite a number of months to just help, as a region, to help the Democratic Republic of Congo to ensure that they deal away with the many militia groups. However, most recently, we've had to withdraw some of those teams to be able to allow the Democratic Republic of Congo. It also speaks into the fact that recently, around September, October, you do have the UN Peacekeeping mission also having been told to pack up and leave. And therefore, what's the translation of that onto the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Very interesting. I remember, I think it must have been President Yoweri Museveni who said that I will start with the UN force. That there were tourists in that place because they have been there for so many, I don't know, years.
Yeah. And you don't see the impact.
There was no impact.
The very same regions that they were peacekeeping are the very same regions that continuously were having instability.
And there were even rumors that actually part of those forces were actually part of the groups that were pilfering the resources of the DRC.
Right.
And so, for me, it doesn't come as a surprise if the DRC tells these fellows to pack their bags and get out of that country as quickly as they can. It doesn't come as a surprise. Of course, the DRC is a sovereign country, so it decides who is on its soil and who is not. And so when they tell the UN to get out of that place because they have failed, in my view, they have actually failed because they haven't made an impact in terms of advancing the security situation in the DRC. Now, the East African Force is another interesting intervention, in my view, because there was a flare of diplomatic activity before it was deployed. There were discussions and consultations and all these kinds of things. And then the EAC was deployed as a peacekeeping mission, not a peace enforcement mission or enforcing mission. I think we must mark the difference between those two, because the two, yes, may sound almost the same.
So give us the differentiation between the two, the peacekeeping and then the enforcement forces.
Now, peacekeeping is to make sure that the two sides do not collide, the two sides that who are fighting each other, that they do not come and fight each other, but also protect the civilian population. That's paramount one of the paramount activity that was part of the peacekeeping of the EAC. It wasn't a force that was meant to enforce peace, because when you enforce peace, whoever fires, you also fire at them between the two sides. And I think that's where the difference came, or comes from, between the two, because there are so many people who thought that actually the EAC force was there to fight all of those numerous groups, including the M23, which it wasn't. And so, but I also touched on the flower of diplomatic activities that involving negotiations and so on. And you remember that Kenya was given the responsibility of leading that force. And Rwanda, because of the fallout they have with the DRC, was said no, they shouldn't be part of that force. And the rest is history. So this mission, the East African mission, was a peacekeeping force. And it is so possible that some people thought that would enforce the peace, it would shoot at those who probably are causing rebellion on the DRC soil, which it didn't do, because that was not part of the mission. And therefore, when the ESC actually comes off the land of the DRC, it also doesn't come as a surprise. It also doesn't come as a surprise because in the view of the authorities in the DRC, the probable anticipation was that these people would stop the rebel groups from firing at or fighting the bona fide army of the DRC, which didn't happen. And so, with that disappointment, I'm not surprised that the EAC is also being told to pack the bags and get out of the DRC. And the SADC, of course, as you know, is said to be coming on the board, and the DRC is also part of the SADC, which brings together some Central African countries, as you know, and then the Southern African countries together. Probably that will shift the stakes on the ground. If the SADC, I've not read
the stakes in the
about
interests.
absolutely. I've not read exactly what the DRC, the SADC force is going to do. Is it going to be peacekeeping or a peace enforcement? If it's a peace enforcement, then it will go combat. It will go combat against the rebels that are fighting the DRC, and probably that will make a change. And there are a few things which I left out actually when it comes to peace enforcement and peace, because I talked about the diplomatic activities that were conducted shortly before the EAC force was deployed, because there was a lot of consultation. It wasn't only a consultation between the EAC countries, but also SADC itself was consulted. And therefore, these people went in, they tried to keep the peace, but of course the fighting continues. So and so forth. And to me it comes as a surprise, because if the elections have been conducted in the DRC and everybody, the guns have gone silent, for me that is a plus. And I hope it becomes a realization to everybody in the DRC, both the government and the rest of the fighting groups, or is it rebels, to keep the peace for as long as they can, because that country has a lot of prospects for growth and development, and also stepping up the economic prowess of the East African region and also the SADC, because DRC is both a member of the EAC and so when the SADC comes, I hope they are going to be peace enforcement force. For us as a country, we have our bilateral relations with the DRC, so we are there after an agreement was struck between the DRC and Uganda, and I really must credit President Yoweri Museveni for that, because he's really a true Pan-Africanist. I'm not saying this because I belong to the administration that we have, but in my view, this is a plus for us as a country, but also as the region. So we are there on a bilateral agreement between us and the DRC to run after those who are causing problems, not only in the DRC, but also sometimes, or many times, actually crossing the border to come and cause problems here. So that bilateral relation still stands. It is the East African, because some people have been confusing the two. That the EAC mission and then our bilateral intervention in the eastern part of that country, which has not had effective government for a very long time, and therefore it has been a breeding ground for so many rebel groups as a result, because it has no effective government. So we are there under the auspices of that bilateral agreement. The EAC was there because of the regional bloc, negotiations and flare of diplomatic activity. If they have been told that their packs should be packed and they get out of that place, because theirs was supposed to be peacekeeping and not peace enforcement, because peace enforcement would actually dictate that you're going to real combat to make sure that you shoot at those who are, absolutely. And of course, the other thing which I wanted to mention is that the DRC is a sovereign country, so it can strike an agreement either with the region or with the individual regional countries, like what we have between Uganda and the DRC. Given the fact that the DRC has been part of the East African Community, it struck an agreement with the EAC, and so came out the peacekeeping force.
All right. Let's look at it from the perspective of diplomacy. What is the opportunity of diplomacy and the role of diplomacy in actually ensuring that there's fostered peace for the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Well, diplomacy, in my view, can never stop, because it's a continuous process. I mean, when you look at the problem between Israel and Hamas, even if there is fighting, intense fighting, in fact, bad fighting, real fighting, but diplomacy continues. So yes, I've heard about the DRC recalling its ambassador from Kenya. I've also heard about Kenya recalling its ambassador from the DRC, but that's part of the diplomacy. But eventually, because of the fact that the DRC needs the EAC and the EAC needs the DRC, I am sure there are diplomatic activities that are ongoing, some of them may not see, in order to ensure that yes, that problem is solved politically and diplomatically, and we come to the realization that we as a region, we need each other. And I believe that everybody should give space to that diplomatic activity to ensure that the DRC remains part and parcel of the East African region, and the East African region must really go out of the way to ensure that the DRC remains part of the EAC.
Okay.
And I have no doubt about those diplomatic activities.
All right. So you have emphasized that there is need for us as East African community to have the DRC on board by all means. Let's talk about that in terms of trade and socio-economic development, also in line with the fact that there's an embargo most recently having been lifted off the DRC.
Absolutely. And I will start with our friends who normally lecture us about democracy. The Americans, the Europeans, I will never leave them because they lecture us so much more than anybody else. When you look at the US, there's a lot of trading in the US itself. That the US itself as a country trades with itself. Because they have the numbers over almost 300, I think about 300 million people. And given their disposable incomes that are available to an individual American, there's a lot of trading within the US itself, even before you talk about, for instance, what they trade with China and the rest of the countries. So that initial, trading pattern is extremely important for any country. When you look at Europe, the EU, it also has a lot of trading among itself. Forget about what they trade with China and the rest of the countries. So recently, they've run into problems with Russia, but they used to trade in terms, Russia was supplying a lot of gas, and the Europeans were trading, exporting lots of goods and services to the Russians. So it's extremely important for us to understand that this initial internal trading is extremely important, especially if people have the capacity to have those disposable incomes to buy goods and services which are produced again from within that very country. So coming back home to the East African region, it's extremely important for us that we have to create that capacity within the region to ensure that this region creates an opportunity for us to produce as many goods and services that can be consumed within the region itself, even before we begin talking about sending our goods and services to AGOA. Because sometimes I think we make a mistake that the only trade that is there that brings money in these countries is actually that which we do.
And the only trade that should be amplified and promoted should be that with the Europe, for instance.
So the DRC is that's why I've been emphasizing the point that the DRC, and I'm happy that the President Yoweri Museveni and the rest of the regional leaders have been emphasizing this regional integration, because we must trade amongst ourselves.
Paint for us that picture in figures. When we look at, for example, the AGOA case and the trade within for DRC and us, what are those figures in terms of trade? Well,
AGOA, at least from the unofficial report which I have, is that the volume of trade between Uganda and the US in terms of AGOA has been in the region of about $200 million US. Now, superimpose that with what we had been trading with the Southern Sudan, with the GOS, before the start of the war in Southern Sudan, because it was in the region of about $1.2 billion US.
Wow.
That is only Southern Sudan. We're supplying foodstuffs.
Like 4 times what we are trading with the Americans.
Absolutely. We're supplying foodstuffs to Southern Sudan. We're taking their matoke. I was hearing of stories of cassava gardens being booked by Southern Sudanese in northern Uganda, even before the cassava matured, so that when it matures, it just goes to Southern Sudan, where been, for instance, supplying lots of fish. And that's why the president got concerned and unknown to many people, especially those who just make a noise about what government steps have been done. The quarantine on fishing on the lakes, it was because the fish were being depleted, because people were actually fishing, even the young ones. But now those fish have rebounded, and we have the quantities enough. So we've been selling all sorts of things to Southern Sudan, and the region before, as I've said, before the start of the war in Southern Sudan, we were making $1.2 billion US. Yeah, that was a plus. The DRC, the president the other day was talking about making roads into the DRC, which is underway anyway, because those roads are actually under construction. The statistics can be given by the Minister of Works. That is for purposes of regional integration and also ensuring that trade is promoted as much as possible, so that we can actually integrate the region, because there are 2 ways of integrating the region. 2 most important ways, but of course there are others. One of them is the political integration. The other one, if people have done economics and geography, is apart from political integration, is economic integration. And the president of Uganda, President Yoweri Museveni, has been very passionate about both, and that's why the EAC is now stronger than it has been before. forget about the small problems that we may find, because even when you look at the EU, they've had their own problems as far as political and economic integration is concerned. I mean, the other day, the UK Brexit, everybody remembers, the UK jumped out of that thing. So that is always a challenge. There is nothing, in other words, in the political processes of any country that will just run through without problems. So likewise, the East African region has had problems in as far as integration is concerned, but that should not make us stop the processes of economic and political integration, because they are really so important to us if we must grow and develop as a country, initially Uganda, and also as a region. So those things are extremely important. So that integration is extremely important for the region, so that we can benefit from each other. We trade with the DRC. We are now making roads into the DRC. There is a lot of trade that is going on, and that is part and parcel of integration. Of course, there could be cultural integration. The cultural integration, we can do it through language, because the Congolese speak very good Swahili.
Yeah.
It is Ugandans who actually lost it at some point in time, and Ugandans probably need to be brought to speed.
No, they didn't lose it again because of the political interferences. It was looked at as a language of an offender who was to offend you. So that's really how it came out.
But it's good that the government has now said that we must reintroduce the teaching of Swahili in schools, so that all of us I can speak not so fluent Swahili, but I would understand.
It can help you get food.
Absolutely, it can help me to ask for food. And
okay, all right. So in terms of the regional trade, you've talked about the report that gives us the statistics of $1.2 billion in terms of regional trade with the DRC, and that can actually be improved over establishment of certain factors being put on ground. And so with the integration that you talked about, what can be those promoters that as a regional bloc should be focused on to enhance more trade for the Congo and the rest of the members of the community?
Absolutely. In my view, the most important one is political stability in the entire region. And so every leader in this region must make sure that they promote that political instability, because without political instability in the region, it means many things, but I can mention it too. One of them is that you actually take away resources that would have otherwise been used for development into buying weapons to fight. That is one of the things. The second one is that once there is political instability, for instance, in the DRC or in Southern Sudan or in Uganda, and of course I didn't want to mention the other day that there was that closure of the border between Uganda and Rwanda. So that level of political stability normally impedes economic activities between these countries. And therefore, each one of these East African community countries must ensure that we promote peace in the region as much as we can. And we should go all out of the way to ensure that we forestall all circumstances on the ground that would otherwise promote political instability, because once we have political instability in the region, that is going to crush all the opportunities that we can think of that would bring development and growth in the region. So it's extremely important for us to have political stability. That determines everything, whether you want to talk about economic integration, whether you want to talk about cultural integration. As long as there is political instability, you will not achieve any one of those.
All right. Absolutely. In your diplomatic capacity, Ambassador, what is your Christmas message to Ugandans?
Christmas messages should be, of course, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to all Ugandans. And secondly, let's keep the peace, because it's only a peaceful environment that can promote growth in our country and also in the region. It's extremely important. Keep the peace.
All right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Mayega, who has given us his 2 cents and powerful perspectives on the conversation, reflecting on, of course, the just concluded Democratic Republic of Congo elections, the impact of that within the region in terms of peace, stability, as well as trade. He has put emphasis on political integration being the #1 tool that can enhance and push the region by and far to be competitive across the continent. That brings us to the end of this conversation. We'll be returning more with conversations. Do stay with us.